Hi, I'm Carl Lubbridge from Extra Cheesy Games, and tonight I'd like to go over a shader tutorial on water distortion and kind of go through a technique that I've recently started using more. In my game, Humans Must Eat, the game is kind of a cartoon style, so I'm not really after super precise water. So I'm looking for a technique that will give me a little more of a cartoon look. So let me just show you what I came up with. Alright, so in my game you have these maps where you get little chunks of an area where you're going to be playing. And in this case, I want to talk a little bit about this water that you're seeing down here. So let me go down and look at this a little bit closer. And so what I'm doing here is I wanted something that looked a little less real because it's not meant to kind of draw a lot of attention to itself. I just want the water to kind of look distorted a little bit. And so a couple of things about this. First of all, the water has a transparent edge. So you can see to the side there, you can see through it. The sparkles you're seeing is actually a particle system on top of this. And the rest of this is what is being done in the shader. Now, a technique I've used in the past to do water is sometimes I'd take a mesh in Maya and slice it up into like a grid. And then I would take the UVs, and there's a way to randomly move the UVs just a little bit so that it's not uniform. And that causes the UV map to kind of warp its way through the mesh if you scroll the UVs. That technique is a way I used to do a lot of this, but I think this technique is a little easier to set up, and it doesn't require a mesh to be quite as cut up. Not that that matters. Frankly, if you look at the mesh, the way this is set up, it's pretty crude. That's what it looks like under the hood. Let's see if I can show this with both. You see, it's just a mesh that's been conformed to this edge. But let's go ahead and I'll go over to Maya real quick and show you the setup in here, in there. So in Maya, let me pull that down. The terrain skin, the way I built these terrains in Humans Must Eat is I build the terrain so that it's just a chunk of terrain, some road, and I only want to focus on the area you're going to be playing. And in this case, I just made a little depression in the terrain skin and dropped this mesh that conforms to the edge. There's nothing really fancy about it. I mean, it's just a mesh that's been cut up and smoothed one time so that it would be smooth. The UVs in here are just projected like this. There's nothing too fancy about that. The way I've been doing these terrain skins, just as a side note, the terrain itself, this part of it here, is actually the unique stuff. And these little feature models that are sitting on here are actually, these are just copies of what they look like in Maya. But in reality, they're all going to be prefabs inside of Unity. I just put them in here for the sake of lighting. When I send this mesh over to Substance Painter to paint it, it just makes it so I know where things are, and it also bakes out some ambient occlusion for me that I like. So that's pretty much the extent of how that's set up over in Maya. All right, let's talk a little bit about the way this shader is set up. I call this shader HME Warping Water. There are two texture ports. One is the albedo for the water itself, and the other is the alpha. Now, as I write this, sometimes you'll look at it and go, why did I do it this way or that way? I actually could have put the alpha inside of the water. It's one of those questions, well, would I use this cloud somewhere else? Maybe. So I just decided to make it two separate maps. The one thing that happens here is in the parameters, I have a warp intensity. If I crank this up, I can get this to be much more dramatic what it does. But, you know, this is one of those effects where you got to just tune it where it makes sense, like that. Okay. The warp speeds are just so I could speed it up in one direction over another. Sometimes that stuff's useful, sometimes it's not. If I set this to 0, I basically get no warp. But this UV movement, I actually put this in. This is the second take on this video, and I actually left that in there from the previous video. But all I'm doing is moving the scroll and the UVs along, so that's actually not associated directly with this. But normally, you know, I just set this fairly low to like this. And you know what? There's no, when you're making visual effects like this, it really isn't. There isn't a scientific paper I follow for this stuff. It's more like, what does it look like when it's done? You know, to me, that's the end result. In reality, this looks more like a heat shimmer than it does water. And I fully acknowledge that. But, you know, I kind of look at this as like, well, it's a stylized water. And, you know, who knows? Maybe you could put this under, say you have a swimming pool in your level, and you wanted to have a water on the surface, but you wanted to look like there was some there's a word for it that's escaping me late at night, refraction that you'd want to show under the water. You could do that kind of with this kind of effect is something that's happening on the underside. You know, there's really no rules to how this is set up. If it looks good or does what you want, then you did it right. There isn't nobody that's gonna. There'll be somebody that'll say, "Oh, I could have done it better." Good for them. That's all I got to say about that. All right, let me show you the map, how I set up the distortion map, because it's extremely complicated. I'm going to leave this here for a little bit later in the video. Basically, this distortion map was made like this. I said, make me a map, 256 by 256, and I make sure I'm using black and white, and I hit filter, render clouds. That's my distortion map. That's how hard it was to make this. Because what we're going to do is we're going to take this map and we're actually going to scroll it. And if you did this inside of Photoshop, let's do an offset here. See how when I scroll this, it stays, it repeats on all the sides, so it stays continuous. But by just moving a little bit, if you took a given spot, like let's just say right here in the middle, what you're doing is you're kind of moving through a cloud of numbers that kind of goes up and down. And in this case, they're just going from black to white. But we're going to show you what I did in the shader to kind of give this more of a positive, negative type of an effect. Anyway, so that's how I generated the map. Let's go look at this shader now. I'm in mono development now. I'm not going to explain most of the basic stuff that I've explained several times in the past. Obviously, there's my properties. I've got 2 textures here. There's my parameters. I range them. Usually I do range my properties just because there's no sense letting it go out to 1,000 when it does nothing. Usually there's even a very small range where it makes sense. So I try to do that. This is a alpha shader. So I do have I put it in the render queue that is transparent. That means it's drawn later in the render pipeline. I'm not writing to Z, and I am using just a basic blend, the most elementary blend formula that you always use, okay? Now, this isn't a surface shader. This is a Vertex fragment program. Part of the reason I choose one over another is I like to know exactly what I'm getting. In this particular case, I really wanted to get down and dirty with the UVs and the vertex color. So that's why I chose this. So on the vertex data being fed into the shader, I've got the position information, I have the UVs that were set up in Maya, and the vertex color. And really all I care about in the vertex color in this particular shader is the alpha. Okay. The vertex defragment output, though, actually, you'll notice this was a float 2 on UVs. On the vertex defragment, it's a float 4, and I'm going to show you what I'm doing there. Looking at these things, sometimes I'll see a mistake. This text core should be text core 1, whatever. Doesn't matter. All right, so in a vertex program, I got to, first of all, I declare this vertex defragment. This is the data that's going to come back out of the vertex program. And so this structure, I call it O. And I see that all the time when you make shaders. It just abbreviates that to O. I'm multiplying the vertices against the model view projection matrix. That puts the vertex from local space out into world space, and then make sure it's corrected for your projection. Now, the beginning of the magic here is I'm taking my UVs and I am using this macro called transform text. This is built into CGFX, which has been included here. And that is what permits the shader to do this right here, where I can take and offset and repeat this shader or tiling, right? That's the macro that deals with that, and it's not very complicated math. It's fairly basic math, but it's nice that it's there for us. And originally I did not do this with the UV, so I'm going to take that out, because really I was showing that in the previous video to show how water would move. Normally it would just kind of sit still in a pond. I wouldn't necessarily need to move it. Now, one thing I did change, and I think now I look back at it why I did it. Originally I was doing that same transform to my copy, because notice this is the XY. So in the shader it's XYZW. Inside of shaders, those parameters are completely at your discretion how to use those. So I declared the X and Y is going to hold the primary UVs. The ZW is going to hold the warp map UVs. And I realized after I did this, I actually took out that transformation, but then I realized if I leave that in, what that lets me do is I can increase this and make the water tighter, right? So the higher I make these numbers, the more tight the water effect becomes. Although you will see repeating in that. If I go lower, am I getting any effect? Did I remember to save that? Always make sure you save your shaders, because if you don't save them, it won't take the effect. ZW. Is that doing anything? I swear that it wasn't doing anything. Let's set it to extreme. Sometimes you really want to see if it's doing anything, you set it to extreme. Well, that didn't do much, did it? I don't know. Let's see. See, and if I do it at 0, it still works, because frankly I'm just pushing the whole thing around. You know why that's doing that? It's because, see what I'm doing? That's why this isn't working. See this macro, see, you gotta think these things. This macro is tied to a given UV set. In this case I was doing the main text. Let's do it to the warp text instead. Let's see if that makes any difference. Yeah, see you got to pay attention to those little details. Now it's doing something. By changing that macro to properly go with that, I can take the density of the wave, the effect, and make it tighter, more broad. So let's see what happens if we set that to 0. What happens if we get 0? See, if we do 0, then we get just the whole thing is just scrolling along. Let's leave that at 1. It's kind of interesting. I mean, this is actually how I learned shaders, was just by trying different things. That's actually pretty good water by itself. Usually I've had to use normal maps for that. That's interesting. So, it's a lot of this is observation and kind of just remembering what you did. That's interesting. What happens if you set it really high? Let's see what happens. Oh, yeah, that's stupid. But, maybe there's a reason that you do that sometimes. It's all about experimenting and then remembering what you learn. That's why you learned how to do this stuff. See, I almost think that looked better at 10 and 10. That looked more like water to me. And if I put some transparency in that, it might even look pretty decent. Let's kill the. It's not gonna work. But anyway, see, you can get playing with this stuff, and pretty soon you waste an hour. Okay. Go down further into the shader. So now I'm taking the UVs to get projected. Now, if I don't do this stage here, where I'm actually adding to the UVs the time times this warp, what will happen here? Make sure you save. It should just sit still. Yeah, and that's because now it's not being moved in time. Now, a point that I thought of when I was doing this is people might wonder, well, what's happening to the UVs at every iteration? And the answer is this. Every time a shader starts over on a new piece of geometry, the numbers are always reset. So what we're doing is we're adding a changed value over time. So in the case of using time, it's increasing, right? So time allows me to take and increase the UVs, and you'll notice I'm doing this modulus 1 here. What that does is it makes sure that that time doesn't get too big, because what will happen is there's only so much precision in a shader, and it may run fine without that modulus in there, but what will happen is, let's say this thing ran for 5 minutes. What will happen is the UVs will become increasingly more unstable, and pretty soon you get this thing where they start to flicker and they'll start to act all warpy. By doing this modulus, this ensures that I never get that number too big. And so I found that to be a pretty helpful tip on how to deal with adding time to UVs in particular. I'm doing this both in U and V. I could just, I do this so that if I want to, if you do them both, they kind of go into diagonal. If you do one, it goes forward or sideways, depending on how you set that up. Last thing I do is transfer the color. Now, this transfer vertex to fragment, this is actually for lighting, so I get the shadows in there. If you don't put that in there, it'll still run, but it won't get any shadows or cast shadow. Actually, I think this is to receive shadow is what that actually does. All right. All right, so let's go down in the fragment program. Now, here I'm doing my clarification, where rather than using the cryptic i.uv.xy to define a UV, I actually convert it over into something that's more human. Same for the warp. And so here is where I read the warp. And then I take the value and subtract 0.5. And you might wonder, why do I do that? Well, the reason being is, let's take that line out. Let's look at what happens to this thing. It may not look that different in a lot of cases, but in effect, what I'm doing to the UVs is I'm starting, let's say the UV was at 0, 0. And by taking the value that comes from that warp map, I am adding and subtracting the warp from that UVs. And since it can never go very high, I'm basically drifting off of, like if this was the UV, this add is coming in and it's slightly shifting the UVs plus and minus. If I don't do this -5 here, it'll only go in one direction like this, right? So by doing the subtraction here, I'm getting it so it subtracts it out and it'll only go off so far, okay? This lerp, let me think, what am I doing here? Yeah, what this is doing here is, if with this warp intensity, I'm making it so that no matter how far it goes off, by doing this warp intensity, I can tell it to clamp it back in to a certain distance. So maybe if I didn't have any of this clamping, it might go clear out to here. The warp intensity in this lerp forces it to tighten the range that effect is taking place in. And the last thing I'm doing is just simply adding the warp into the UVs that are coming out. This gets me my light information. I'm not going to talk about that here, but here I'm actually reading the UVs from after it's been warped. I'm multiplying it by the color that came in from the vertices, timesing it by brightness, and adding or multiplying in the shadow right there. Okay? So that in effect is that shader. Now, I thought just for fun, let's do a couple of weird distortions to this to show you what happens to it. Let's save this guy. Come back out here. Now that map is a cloud map, so let's give it something a little more. Let's just go in and paint a couple of modifications in like this. Let's just distort this heavily. Because, part of learning shader and visual effects is experimenting and then just kind of remembering what you did and thinking when someday somebody comes along and says, hey, how do you do this effect? You can think back through the things you've seen and experienced, and you might remember something that was useful. So I'm going to save this into here, and I'm just going to call this Cloud Test Cloud Warp 2. Okay. All right, so let's go grab that texture, Cloud Warp 2. And I'm gonna turn this tiling back down because sometimes you can't see it. Right, so see what that did? It kind of faceted the look just a little bit. Let's slow that down just a lot. You can kind of see what's happening there. So you see by kind of changing that warping that occurs, I can get different effects. And I was going to show what happens like if you take an image and drop it in here. Trying to get sued by Warner Brothers. Let's stop this in here. Save that. Oops. Yeah, thanks, Photoshop. Sometimes I want to slap Photoshop around. Cloud Test 2. Let's see, I can't remember. I swear I'm slightly dyslexic. All right, so Cloud Test 2. So see, now you can kind of see the duck in there. Let's tile that. But you got to stop and think about where would that be usable? Well, maybe you had a glass sphere or something, and you had an image kind of embedded in it. There's all kinds of stuff you can do with this. I'm moving the UVs over time, but you could just as easily modify UVs based off of the direction the camera was coming from or whatever, and it might give you some other interesting effect. Point is, there is no real substitution here for finding what you want, but by experimenting things. I once watched a show on the way they used to do sound recordings or sound effects on the radio, and the guy had a table full of crap, everything from something to twist and all he did is remembered all that stuff and what kind of sounds they made, and he would just pull them out. Oftentimes effects are the same way, where you just try things, and when you find something that works, you just remember to use it when the right time comes up. So I'm going to remember this water one like that because I think that's not bad. And if I speed the time up just a little bit, that's not a terrible water for especially a cartoon water, right? So I hope this has been useful to you. If you have any questions or any thoughts on this, I'd love to hear your comments. I'm probably going to do a couple more water shaders because there's other ways of doing this where it's not quite as cartoony, where you use normal maps and you kind of do a similar thing where you're blending normal maps. Would be curious to try this technique using normal maps and see how much closer they'd get, because oftentimes I just took normal maps and slid the UVs and lerped them together so they'd get this effect where they'd come over. Well, what if you warp it and put that in there? That's the kind of stuff I want to see, and I got to put it in my bank of know-how for future reference. But appreciate you watching, and if you like this, give this a thumbs up. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. And just keep trying and experimenting and build up your own library of things and thoughts how you build these effects. And hopefully this was useful, and thanks for watching.